next speaker is Mark Glover. Mark has been an animal rights advocate for more than 30 years. He worked for Greenpeace in the 1980s and worked on the first United Kingdom ban on importing seal fur. After leaving Greenpeace, he started an anti-fur group, which became known as Respect for Animals, and led a consumer campaign in the United Kingdom against the wearing of fur, which resulted in the closure of 90% of fur outlets, and a political campaign that resulted in the ban of fur factory farming in the year 2000. Mark received the Lord Erskine Award in 2009 by the RSPCA for his contribution to animal welfare. And Mark has been vegan for 22 years. Welcome.
Well, first of all, thanks so much to Rosa for inviting me to come along. And thanks to Eddie, not only is he a great roadie, he's got a great beard. So I'm very excited to be here, and as I say, thank Rosa so much for the invitation, as well as for all her hard work in putting this event together. And it really is a very important event, because I believe that this is a pivotal moment in the anti-fur campaign for reasons that I'll go into. But as activists, as people have given up your Saturdays to be here, you will play a vital role in where we go with this campaign and with this movement from now. You see, as many of you know, on one hand, we've got huge fashion companies like Burberry and Gucci ending their use of fur. And only last week, the British Fashion Council declared that London Fashion Week, which is going to be happening, maybe happening now, next week, will be fur-free. And I think that's just such an incredible development from 5 years ago. The British Fashion Council just saying no fur in any London fashion shows. Interestingly, the CEO of Burberry, and we used to call the company Furberry, because to be honest with you, I thought they'd be one of the last ones to give it up. The CEO said, "I don't think fur is compatible with modern luxury and with the environment in which we live." It's such a significant development and a significant statement from someone of that standing. This is all very positive and very good, and we can slap ourselves on the back over it. But the fact is that 100 million animals are still being killed each year just for their fur. 100 million animals. That's more than one animal every single second of every day of every year. All the time I'm speaking, more than one animal a second equivalent of is killed for its fur. So we still have a massive job to do, and it is people in this room, it's you and I and the others, our colleagues who aren't here today, who are going to have to do it. All of us, because you've got to ask yourself, if it's not us, then who's going to do it? And the answer is no one. It's down to us. I'm going to speak to you about our experience in the UK. Rose has asked me to come and share our experiences, and looking at the campaign in the UK, which has had some successes over the past 30 years. Yes, please. I know you can't read the slide, it doesn't matter, but back in the early 1980s, the fur trade in the UK was huge. The British Fur Trade Association regularly placed ads in national newspapers like this one, listing all of their retail members. And on that list, there are over 250 retail outlets for fur in the UK. The scale of the industry and the animal suffering seemed overwhelming, but the fur trade had a weak link. And we looked at the mechanics of the fur trade and the dynamics, but it had a weak link, and the weak link was the consumer. A very familiar ad, and as part of the history of the fur campaign. But people back then, and to a certain extent now, only spent large sums of money on fur because they wanted to be seen in it. And that still applies. The dynamics have changed somewhat, but that still applies today. But the fact is, the majority of people back then and now don't wear fur. So the dynamic was in our favour, and the trick was to shift fur from being seen as an item of fashion into a badge of shame. This ad is very familiar to many people now, but back in the day, back in the 1980s when it came out, it was absolutely groundbreaking. In fact, that poster won every single advertising poster for the advertising award that it could. It was absolutely without precedent. The brief for the ad, given to the ad agency, was that when a fur coat wearer walks past it, they can feel everyone around them looking at them, thereby taking away the motivation of spending 10 grand on the coat. It was a new kind of consumer campaigning, and it worked, and the impact was rapid. Fur shops began to close due to falling demand. At that same time, as I said, the fur trade in the UK was huge and thriving. It even had its own monthly magazine, Fur Review. I used to love it, getting it every single month. It soon developed a keen interest in our work, and it records the fact that back in the day when I left Greenpeace to establish the organisation called Lynx, for some reason they were hyper interested in what we were doing. Every month it included a section on who was selling what types of fur, and as you can see, back in 1985 there was quite a choice. All of the dealers listed the types of fur that they were selling with their phone numbers. And shamefully, back in 1985, in that list, if you look hard enough, you'll see monkey and jaguar and all sorts of different types of fur, all legal back then. But by May 1989, that was their last issue. So just 4 years later, the magazine closed down, indicative of an industry in decline, certainly in the UK. As evidence of this, they always tried to make out it was due to terrorist threats, etc. As evidence of this, in the same section in the final issue of their marketplace was reduced to that, compared to the 2 pages in the issue 4 years before. I think it's pretty conclusive evidence that the industry was not in great shape. So by the mid-1990s, with this very seriously weakened retail fur industry and therefore organised fur lobby, which derived its funding from retail sales and auction sales, with a very seriously weakened fur lobby and with mounting evidence exposing the cruelty of the fur trade, and in particular the conditions inside fur farms, we began to look at getting a ban on fur farming. And this picture actually shows the inside of a quite notorious fur farm that we were subsequently sued over, but that's the subject of another lecture. But that was a British fur farm as they were back in the 1980s. So after an intense and hard campaign, we succeeded with the effort, and I'm proud to say that in 2000, the British Parliament passed the Fur Farming Prohibition Act, outlawing the breeding of animals for their fur in the UK. We, knowing how the constitution worked in the UK, Nikki and I were there and celebrating when we knew the exact moment the Queen had to put her signature to that bill on a piece of parchment. And then subsequently, because the way Britain works, she had to do it again for bills in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So, yes. But the key part of that law was that it was based on the concept of public morality, which we have subsequently seen is an incredibly important element for animal protection legislation. And I'll touch on a couple more examples in a minute. But again, it was a kind of groundbreaking moment when an industry could be banned that harmed animals on the grounds of public morality. About the same time, again, I don't expect you don't need to read this, but the European Commission has a very important committee back then called the Scientific Committee on Animal Health and Animal Welfare. I'll refer to as scoreboard. But it carried out what was to become the most comprehensive and authoritative piece of work studying fur farming. And it produced a very long, 180-page objective scientific report, most authoritative piece of work that had been done on it. Amongst its many conclusions and recommendations, the key one was this, and it concluded that since current husbandry systems cause serious problems, these are the words of the European Commission, serious problems for all species of animals reared for fur, efforts should be made for all species to design housing systems which fulfill the needs of the animals. So this is a fundamental report acknowledging that the conditions in fur farms were no good and they had to change. In a minute, we'll look at what efforts the fur industry put in over the 17 years since that report to make the changes that Scoreboard said were needed. Growing concerns over fur farming across Europe at this time led to bans, and you're going to hear about another incredibly significant one from Nicole in a little while. But they led to bans in a large number of countries now, many using that same public morality argument that I referred to earlier. The critical line and element to these bans, and the line of argument, has been the overwhelming evidence shown through countless opinion polls that large majorities of people reject fur farming as a civilized, modern-day allowable practice. And I'll just take a moment out from the European story to remind us in the room about the scale and depth of fur farming here in the US. The USA is the sixth largest fur breeding country in the world. And as you can see, breeding a total of 3.6 million mink every year. Now these figures may not be completely up to date, these figures are quite hard to get hold of, and there may be people in the room that have better statistics, but it's a good measure of 3.6 million animals every year. Sixth largest breeding country. When you take out the Netherlands, and if you split up the Baltic states, the America then comes fourth. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. So, going back to the bans and how they came about, as I said, the public morality argument, public opinion were vital, but the fact is the basics of fur farming are the same everywhere, the same here, they're the same in Europe, the same in China. It involves the keeping of what are still essentially wild animals in tiny barren cages. Those conditions invariably lead to distressing problems for the animals, self-mutilation, stereotype behaviour, that rapid pacing backwards and forth, which is a clear indicator of poor welfare, even cannibalism. And I will be definitely coming back to that in a second. The case against fur factory farming is clearly made in our recent report, this report of the same title, which not only updates the scoreboard report with the more recent published scientific research, it also looks at existing European legislation and argues that we say that fur farming should be already illegal under existing legislation. It also goes into the fur trade's cynical attempts to defend itself with its own project that I'll come on to. Now, I know it's mostly European-based when it comes to the legislation, but the bulk of the report is science-based and shows the scientific case against fur farming, and that's universal. It applies here as much as it does anywhere else in the world. So as I said, we argue that fur farming is already illegal or should be under existing EU law, and it should be banned in all the remaining countries that allow it. There's a piece of legislation, a council directive, which means that it's applicable throughout all 28 countries of the EU, soon to be 27 when the UK's taken its step to leave the EU. But the key paragraph says, no animal should be kept for farming purposes unless it can be reasonably expected on the basis of its genotype or phenotype that it can be kept without detrimental effects on its health or welfare. Well, the evidence is overwhelming that they can't, and so therefore, under that legislation, it should be banned. Add to this, there's a Council of Europe recommendation specific to fur farms. Council of Europe recommendations are simply that, the recommendations. They're not binding in law, but nevertheless it's quite clear. It says no animal should be kept for its fur if the animal belongs to a species whose members cannot adapt to captivity without welfare problems. And again, the evidence is clear. They cannot, and therefore should not be kept. So the fur trade's reaction to all of this has been absolutely shameful. Many of you are familiar with the reaction. Kimball's given a really good account of the kind of cynical approach they adopt to propping up and promoting themselves. The fur farming industry has made no attempts to meet those scoreboard recommendations. The cage sizes are the same as they were 20 years ago before scoreboard came out. The conditions in the farms, the inspections, etc., are by and large identical. But the fact is, it's an industry that cannot make those changes. It is driven by the profit motive and competition throughout a global economy. The cage sizes of factory farms for mink are the same the world over. And it's because they've been developed, as I say, to increase the profitability of the operation, and developed for the operator's convenience, not the animal's biological and behavioural needs. And just one classic example is that a mink cage is never longer than a person's arm. And if you think about it, the reasons are obvious. So they can reach in and grab these terrified animals as and when they need to. What it has done, though, and again, Kimberly expressed it very well with reference to how it's marketing to children. It's very good and spends a great deal of money on public relations. And it's had one scheme after another to label fur in a way that legislators and the public will see as acceptable, and to try and put a gloss on its morally bankrupt practices. The latest one, though, which we're very familiar with in Europe, and it's going to happen over here as well, is perhaps the worst in terms of fur farming and the most dangerous one yet. It's called One Fur. It's an industry-designed accreditation and labelling scheme, and the primary aim of which is to maintain the status quo. while giving the fur trade lobbyists ammunition to stave off new legislation and regulation. It's simply a crude attempt by the industry, and it's just entirely cynical, to emulate the European Commission's own welfare quality assurance schemes for other farm animals. Here in the US, there is the Fur Commission. It has a certification program for fur farms, along with the equally useless standard guidelines for the operation of mink farms. It's a 28-page document. It just says nothing new. It just endorses the current practices of fur farmers, and as I said, they are uniform around the world. So I would liken these bogus schemes and the fur trade's shameful manipulation of science in the same light as the tobacco industry and climate change deniers. And there are many books that have been written on the subject, including this one, which I would recommend, The Merchants of Doubt, that go into great detail to show how the tobacco industry, the oil industry have used and abused science and lied to keep their industries going. I think in the future edition of this, there should be, and perhaps will be, a chapter on the fur issue and how the fur trade have used exactly the same techniques to try and defend itself. As everyone in the room is acutely aware, and you've seen reference to it previously, the US, Canada and Russia also have thriving trapping cultures and industries. The best estimates are that between 3 and 5 million animals are being trapped every year in the United States just for their fur. The European Union also looked at this, and it's a sorry episode, but a very good example of lobbying and perhaps how not to do it, and the scale of the industry that you're taking on. The European Union looked at and wanted to ban the use of leg hold traps throughout the EU, as well as the import of furs from animals caught in them. And in 1991, a regulation, another piece of European legislation was brought in that accomplished the former, banning the use of leg hold traps around the whole of the EU, so it's illegal to use them there. But as a result of the intense lobbying, primarily and shamefully from Canada and the USA, the import ban was effectively kicked into the long grass. It was watered down by the introduction of so-called humane trapping standards, which were forced on the EU by the governments here and in Canada, but nothing could be further from the truth. And I won't go into the details of them, they're available in all sorts of sources, but the notion that the standards that they're using now to permit those imports to continue are humane is utterly shameful, and shame on the EU for accepting them. So what can we do about this? Where are we going in the future? We have a campaign plan. The outline of it, which is up on the slide, we think it's a very ambitious and potentially effective plan. That obviously a lot of the detail is not included in this slide for obvious reasons, but I would be very happy to discuss any aspect of it with anyone if you're interested in helping out. But the fact is, it is we and the other people here working on the issue that need your help. The overall budget for a campaign like this is substantial, and we need help to raise this. The fact is that Respect for Animals, and I'm going to big up Nicole from Bob the Deer, who's speaking soon, are extremely effective and good at campaigning. What we're perhaps not so good at is fundraising. which is obviously a necessary part of the equation, but certainly in respect for animals, I'll go further. We're terrible at it. We're terrible at fundraising, but our track record proves we're pretty good at campaigning. So we need some help. And I truly believe that our plan outlined here would have a significant impact on this despicable and vile trade. I'm going to say thank you now, but I hope I've got one more slide, and I'm hoping it's going to work. It may not. And I've debated long and hard about this, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. But it shows a 30-second film, and I fully appreciate that you're already motivated and committed on this issue, and do what you can already to campaign against the fur trade. But right now, animals who have no voice, who are relying on us, the people in this room, to stand up for them, are subject to what you see in this film, if we can get it to work. It's only 30 seconds long. It shows an episode of trapping and a scene inside a fur farm. If we can't show it, it will be available on our website. As I say, it's only 30 seconds long, and I fully understand if you do not wish to see it, but it is a timely and terrible reminder of why we have to redouble our efforts to succeed. So what it does show is some undercover film that we took in North America of a guy who's trapped a raccoon and spends 5 minutes trying to step on it, and eventually succeeds to drown it, and it's gut-wrenchingly sad. The second part of the film is the worst piece of film I've seen in 30 years of campaigning inside a fur farm. It was taken by undercover operatives working in Lithuania, and it shows the most extreme and horrible version of cannibalism within a fur farm. These episodes are happening all the time. Trapping is going on right now in this country to catch the animals while the fur is in its prime. Actually, not right now. Trapping season hasn't started yet, but over the winter months, millions of animals will be trapped, as you know, for their fur. In fur farms now, the animals are coming up to the killing season, when they have to kill them all within a short period of time when their fur is in prime condition. And the killing methods, as you know, gassing, electrocution, are absolutely appalling. But in the meantime, for many of those animals, that's a blessed relief. And I'm sorry you can't see the video, but it is an incredibly awful, distressing piece of film. I'll just will now finish. Oh no, this is the longer version. I think this is enough for me. Okay, this is the Lithuanian fur farm. I think we should stop. Yeah, just stop. It's just too much. I'm sorry, but I felt that we really ought to remind ourselves about just what is going on out there and why we have to stop it. And on that note, I will say thank you again. please don't hesitate to come and ask me about anything to do with campaigning. I'm not sure. Have you got? Do you want to do any questions now, or I'll just leave it at that? Okay. So if anyone does have any questions or comments right now, I'd be very happy to try and address them. But like I say, do come back to me if you want to talk about our campaign and how you might want to get involved. Yes.
What type of reception are you getting with government in the UK? You have different political parties, here and listen better. What's it like during politically there?
Well, the only thing that's being discussed in the UK now is Brexit. So there's nothing else happening in the UK, and in fact, there's nothing happening with Brexit either. But that's another long story. We are very much hoping that Brexit may. In fact, there's a new expression for it, isn't it? About Brexit being reversed, but that's another issue. But there's nothing else happening in the UK. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to ask you if there are any pro-animal activists in the European Union, and do you have the endorsement of Theresa May? What does she think about all this?
Oh, good. Yeah, there's very active anti-fur and obviously animal activist organisations within EU countries. Both of our organisations, Bombardier and Respect for Animals, are active within a thing called the Fur-Free Alliance, which is a coalition of organisations based in more than 30 countries now, many of them in Eastern Europe, including Lithuania, where that film was taken. And we work very closely and very effectively, I think. There's always more we can do, but the bans and the work that are happening in Eastern European countries right now are very exciting. Many of them coming about from grassroots individuals who work their socks off, and they're brilliant. And we are able to provide some support through the Fur-Free Alliance. So it's a pretty good setup. Yeah. I should maybe have expanded on the issues of fur here and fur farming here, because, and I understand the legal system and the political system is completely different, but it is disappointing to see it would be nice to see more action from organisations here on fur farming, and we would be very happy to assist and work with people here on the issue of fur farming and trapping. And again, I understand the difficulties and the way the law is framed here and how the difficulties in changing the laws here. But the fur trade does seem to have quite a free run of things on the production methods. The last point on Theresa May is, well, maybe I better skip that. Theresa May will be seen as one of the worst prime ministers the UK has ever had. There are plots against her constantly with her own party, and right now she's got more things on her mind than animals, but she couldn't care less about them anyway. She bravely announced that she wouldn't bring back hunting with hounds, but that was the political reality. She knew she couldn't, but she would have done if she could. Eddie.
Just a quick question. You touched on the whole situation with Brexit, which I don't really understand, but it seems like the UK was very influential on the rest of the EU when it came to animal rights. Do you think that's going to change when Britain extracts itself from the EU?
I'm going to leave part of that question to Nicole, because she's obviously from the Netherlands, which has a different take on it. But it's a good question, and I'm not quite sure I know the answer. Certain initiatives, such as banning seal imports into the whole of the EU, certainly came from, it originally came from a Swedish MEP, but without Britain's involvement in it, it may have been difficult to see that go through. Ban on cat and dog fur into the EU was a UK initiative, but no, I mean, and again, I'm not the best person to answer it, but towards the end prior to the referendum, I think people in Europe were just getting fed up with the UK. All the UK ever did was whine about conditions there, and we pay too much money and blah blah. But you know, it will be a significant loss if the UK does finally leave, and mostly for the UK. The EU is going to punish the UK.
So in your opinion, who do you think is more on the forefront, more the United States or like Eastern Europe as far as banning farming stuff?
Fur farming. Oh, there's no question. I find it difficult to envisage a ban on fur farming here. Countries in Eastern Europe are way ahead. Yeah, I mean there are active bans being looked at and going through their legislatures now. It would be nice to think at a certain point the EU will ban fur farming, but again, constitutionally it's difficult to see how the EU could do that, but it could. But of course, the lobby still within the EU, with countries like Denmark, is first or second highest number of animals being killed for their fur in Denmark every year. It's a tricky problem still. Oh, sorry.
My understanding is that fur farming was banned in the European Union.
No.
2002,
No. In the UK in 2000, and then a number of other countries, I put the list up, have banned it subsequently. Even Norway, which isn't an EU country, has now banned fur farming.
Not UK. My question is European Union.
Yeah, no, it still happens in the European
Because
Union.
I see when I go to Austria, in Vienna, I see a lot of these so-called plastic and very disgusting
Oh yeah.
fur stores.
Yeah. No, selling fur is still legal. It's still legal in Britain. Fur farming is banned in Austria as well, but the sale of fur is still legal, and the import of fur. But you know, ideally in the future, we'd like to get to a position where if you've banned the means of production, and our argument in the UK is that we banned the use of the trap, we banned fur farming, so it's hypocritical to allow imports to continue. So that's certainly part of our plan. Yeah.
It's my understanding that people in the UK were exploding like stink bombs in department stores,
Yeah.
the area where the fur was, and that was happening so much that they lost so much money they stopped selling them in certain stores. Did that have an effect on any aspect?
No,
of
it's
this?
it's just a myth put around by the fur industry. And it backfired on them because they were always, when I used to do interviews in the 1980s with them, they were always talking about us throwing red paint on fur coats and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it hardly ever happened. In fact, I can't even think of an instance of it happening, but it backfired on them because then, again, why would you spend 10 grand on a fur coat if someone's going to throw red paint on it? So they were so stupid in those days. But there were episodes, and there were a couple of really famous ones where the Animal Liberation Front in department stores, tried to put in smoke bombs, not stink bombs, to set off the sprinklers and wreck the contents of the department store. But unfortunately, it did set fire to the department stores, and 2 of them burned down. But you know, again, that backfired on us because then they did point to us and say you're a bunch of terrorists. And with 2 department stores burnt to the ground, it was a sorry episode when we knew we could win the issue on the other arguments without that sort of thing happening to happen. Okay. Ooh, I didn't mean to. Oh, no. Yeah. Cool.
That footage of the trapping incident, that happened not far from here,
It was Pennsylvania.
Where?
Pennsylvania. The trapping. But yeah, the trapping happens all.
Yeah,
All
but
right.
that means that particular episode.
Yeah. Pennsylvania was the highest trapping state. It may still be, which is, you think of it happening way out in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, Pennsylvania is the highest trapping state. Okay, nothing. Oh, sorry, go on. Just.
No, I was just going to say, she just reminded me, we saw earlier during this conference that the firms which were in Sweden quit after, remember the 5,000 links were released? He gave up, he quit. So
we officially announced that
Oh,
program.
okay.
that's it.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah. I mean,
Radical action,
it can. That was very counterproductive in the UK, where mink were released from fur farms in the UK, because at least mink are a native species here. In the UK, they are a terrible problem, and throughout Europe. In fact, the American mink will probably cause. Sorry. The American mink will probably cause the extinction of the European mink, which is a slightly smaller cousin of the American mink, because it's now so widespread and so aggressive and dominant. But no, those things happened in the UK. They were a real problem, again, because they could just say, well, we're a bunch of terrorists and vandals. And on at least, a number of occasions, it was the fur farmers that did it themselves. When they saw their businesses going down the tubes, they just released the animals and claimed on their insurance. Okay, I think that is. Thank you.